She had not moved from the window embrasure in 40 minutes, and she would not move from it until her mother told her she might. That was the arrangement, deposited here at 10 o'clock, the Countess's hand briefly on her shoulder, the instruction delivered low and without warmth. Stand here. Do not cross the room. Do not laugh too loudly. Do not let a single person think you need anything. Lady Isadora Brentworth had learned in 9 years of instruction that the easiest way to survive an evening was to want nothing, and she had become very good at it. She stood with her spine straight and her cup steady, and her face arranged into the expression her mother called composure. And she watched the room at Lady Penworth's rout from her embrasure as though it were a painting she had been commissioned to guard. And she had almost convinced herself, as she so often did, that this was perfectly fine. That this was in fact what evenings were for. When the Duke of Ashmere crossed the room directly toward her, and nothing was fine again, he was not what the room said he was. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it in the 3 seconds before he stopped 2 feet away and looked at her with an expression that was not cold at all, only contained. The way a room looks when someone has shut the window against the weather, not because they dislike the outside, but because they have learned not to let it in. Lady Isadora, he said, forgive the liberty. We have not been introduced. I am Ashmere. Your Grace, she said, may I stand in this window with you for 5 minutes without speaking? He asked. Your mother is across the room watching. She will interpret it as courtship, and she will be wrong. But the wrongness may give you 5 minutes of quiet. Yes or no? She looked at him. She took in those 3 seconds, no more. The coldness the room accorded him, and the actual warmth of his face at 2 feet, and the precision of the offer, which was unlike any offer she had received in her first London season, because it asked her nothing, and promised nothing, and required nothing of her face. She answered quietly, Yes, Your Grace. They stood. He did not speak. She did not speak. The rout moved and chattered around them, and her mother stood across the room with Lady Fenwick and watched them with an expression Isadora could read from 40 feet. Calculation, pleasure, a revised assessment of the evening's prospects. Isadora did not look at her mother. She looked at the window glass, and at the dark square of Grosvenor Square beyond it, and at the faint reflection of the Duke of Ashmere standing 2 feet to her left with his hands behind his back. And she felt, for the first time in 9 years, standing beside a man who had asked her nothing and required nothing of her performance, that the evening had briefly stopped pressing on her chest. At 5 minutes exactly, he bowed. Thank you, he said, and walked away. Her mother crossed the room within 90 seconds. The grip on Isadora's elbow was not quite hard enough to leave a mark through the silk, but it was close. What did he say to you? The Countess asked. He did not speak, Mamma, Isadora said. He stood. The Countess looked at her for a long moment. Do not be clever with me, she said. Not tonight. I am not being clever. He offered to stand in the window without speaking. I said yes. He stood for 5 minutes and left. That is everything that happened. The Countess's expression shifted through several calculations before settling on a form of disbelief she did not bother to conceal. It did not matter. Isadora had told the truth, and the truth had been, for once, exactly what the 5 minutes were. Quiet and sufficient, and entirely her own. 3 weeks earlier, on the 14th of April, Julian Ravensmere, Duke of Ashmere, had been standing in the Almack's supper room reading a card sent in by a footman when he heard 6 feet behind him the particular sound of a woman stumbling on her hem. He did not turn. He had learned in 10 years of practice that turning attracted attention and attention changed behavior. And what he was there to observe was behavior that had not yet been changed. He heard the stumble and the quick intake of breath, and then the silence. 3 seconds of it, in which a young woman was deciding whether to cry. She decided not to, but one tear slipped before the decision was enforced. He knew it had slipped because the Countess was at her daughter's elbow in 10 seconds. 10 seconds, which was fast, which meant she had been watching from across the room. And the grip, when it came, was tight enough to turn the girl to the wall. Julian finished reading the card. He handed it back to the footman. He did not turn his head. "Isadora?" The Countess's voice was low, but the supper room was not large, and the acoustics were unkind. "Swallow your tears. Men hate weakness. I will not have Lavinia's grave be a lesson you failed to learn." "Yes, Mama." "Compose your face. Turn. Walk the negus to your aunt. Smile." There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Julian imagined, without looking, the composition happening. The face rearranged, the spine straightened. The expression settled into something that could pass for ease at a distance of 10 feet. Then the footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, crossing the room. He allowed himself, then, to turn his head slightly. He saw the back of a young woman in ice-white silk, carrying a cup of negus toward an older woman seated near the fireplace. He saw the hand on the cup, the tremor in it, brief and small. And then the deliberate stilling of the tremor. He saw the 2 sentences exchanged about Lady Marchmont's turban, and the release of the cup, and the young woman turning back toward the room with an expression that gave nothing away to anyone who had not seen the tear. Julian put his hand in his coat pocket. The leather journal was there, where it always was. He did not take it out in the room. That night, at Ashmere House in Grosvenor Square, he sat at his writing desk and opened it to the 7th page, and wrote the date and the initials and what he had seen, and that he was marking her, and would return the following Wednesday to confirm. The ink was still wet when he closed the book. The journal had 6 previous entries. Julian had begun it in March of 1818, after a girl at Lady Marchmont's assembly, Miss E.C., 19, with a mother who gripped her wrist when she laughed too loudly, had looked at him across a card room with an expression he recognized from his sister's face, and he had not known what to do with the recognition. He had done nothing. He had gone home and written it down, because writing it down was the only intervention he had known how to make at 26. And because he could not stop thinking that if he had written things down about Celeste, he might have seen the pattern before it became her fate. Miss E.C. of Lady Marchmont's, March 1818. He had intervened, eventually, through her elder sister's correspondence. A letter, carefully worded, that named what he had observed and offered nothing except the observation. Miss E.C. had married Captain Whitby in 1820. A letter had arrived at Ashmere House in 1823, in her own hand. I am well. He had kept that letter inside the journal's front cover until the paper softened at the folds. Miss A.F. of Harbury, 1821. He had not reached her in time. He had written to the wrong relation and waited too long, and she had been married to a man in Derbyshire before his letter arrived. He did not know what had become of her. He had written outcome, not reached in the journal, and closed it, and not opened it again for 6 months. Lady M.S. of Pennington, 1823, not reached. Mrs. C.D. of Whitford, 1825, not reached. Miss R.L. of Ashcombe, 1826, not reached. Miss H.G. of Greyvale, 1828. He had reached Miss H.G., a letter to her grandmother, who had understood immediately and intervened with the force of 70 years of social authority. And the outcome had been a position as a companion in Edinburgh, which was not a triumph, but was not Derbyshire with a man she had not chosen. 2 reached, 4 not. The weight of the 4 lived in the journal's pages, and Julian carried it into every room he entered. And it was why, when he saw Lady Isadora Brentworth swallow a tear and deliver a cup without spilling, he wrote the 7th entry before the ink dried. The following 6 weeks arrived in sequence, and Isadora lived them as she had learned to live everything, from the inside of her own composure, watching herself perform it and finding lately that the watching had developed a quality it had not previously had. She watched herself more closely now. She was not sure why. Lady Marchbury's ball, the 3rd week of May. The Countess had told her at dinner beforehand, "Lord Ashmere will ask you to dance. You will decline." But the Earl, seated at the far end of the table with his mind on a boundary dispute in Dorset, had looked up when Julian's name was mentioned and said, vaguely, that Ashmere was a perfectly good man, and he saw no objection to a single dance, and the Countess had not been able to correct him at the table without making the correction visible. Isadora had watched her mother absorb this with the particular stillness the Countess employed when she was deciding which battle to forfeit in order to win the next one. And she had said nothing, and eaten her soup, and felt something she did not name move through her like water finding a new channel. The dance was a country dance, which meant they were separated and rejoined at intervals, and conversation was possible only in fragments. Julian did not attempt to fill the fragments. He danced with the particular quality of attention he seemed to bring to everything. Present, unhurried, apparently indifferent to whether anyone was watching him. And therefore, Isadora noticed, watched by everyone. "You are comfortable in silence," she said during one of the rejoining intervals. "I have had practice," he said, and rejoined the pattern before she could ask him what that meant. She was still thinking about it when he handed her into the carriage afterward. His fingers closed on hers. One deliberate pressure, unmistakable, lasting 2 seconds before he released her hand and stepped back and the carriage door closed. Her mother was already seated inside, looking at her with an expression that was waiting for something to find fault with. Isadora arranged her face and sat down and said nothing, and felt the pressure of those 2 seconds, the full length of the drive home, and did not name it to herself. But she did not try to forget it either. The Countess's first active move came in the last week of May. She instructed the Earl, who was reading agricultural reports and signed what was placed before him with the distracted goodwill he brought to most domestic matters, to write to Julian through the appropriate channels, discouraging further contact. The Earl composed the letter without fully understanding its purpose, which was evident in its tone, which was apologetic and slightly confused. Julian received it on a Thursday morning, read it once, set it on his writing desk beside the open journal, and did not answer it. Lady Vivian Ravensmere Holdworth arrived at Grosvenor Square on the 1st of June, 19 years old, dark-haired, with her uncle's quality of directness delivered at a considerably higher conversational velocity, and called on the Countess with a formal invitation for Lady Isadora to visit Ashmere Hall in Kent as Vivian's companion for 3 weeks. "It is a young lady's visit," Vivian said, seated across from the Countess in the Brentbury drawing-room with her gloves in her lap and her posture entirely correct. I find the house quiet in June without company. Lady Isadora and I have spoken twice at Lady Marchbury's, and I think we should suit very well." The Countess listened to this with an expression that was doing several calculations at once. The invitation was framed as Vivian's, not the Duke's. The Duke's title was nonetheless attached to the house, the name, and the eventual social consequence of the arrangement. 3 weeks was specific enough to be respectable and long enough to be useful. "Isadora will bring her maid," the Countess said. "Of course," Vivian said, "and she will write every Tuesday." "I will see that she has paper and a franc," Vivian said, and smiled, and the Countess permitted it. Isadora packed one trunk. At the carriage door, her mother held her by the elbow for a moment and delivered the final instruction the way she delivered all instructions. Quietly, and with the certainty of someone who had never been successfully contradicted. "Observe. Do not volunteer. Do not cry." "Yes, Mama," Isadora said. She did not look back as the carriage moved. She watched the houses of Grosvenor Square pass the window, and then the wider streets of London opening toward the Kent Road. And she sat with her hands in her lap and felt the city release her. Gradually, the way a grip releases when the hand finally tires. Ashmere Hall was 3 hours from London, and a different world entirely. The house was old and large and comfortable in the way that houses are comfortable when they have not been recently refashioned for display. The rooms smelled of beeswax and cut grass and old stone, and the windows looked onto gardens that had been allowed to grow with some generosity. And there were no mirrors in the corridors angled to catch a young woman's expression as she passed. Isadora stood in the hall on the first afternoon and felt the silence of the place settle around her. Not the silence of a drawing room where everyone is watching, but the silence of a house that did not require her to be anything in particular. And she stood in it for a long moment before she realized that what she was feeling was the absence of performance, and that the absence was so unfamiliar it had taken her 2 hours to identify it. The weeks at Ashmere Hall moved differently than weeks in London. There was no one watching Isadora for a wrong expression. There was no instruction delivered at the door of each room she entered. Vivienne was good company. She talked a great deal and asked direct questions, and did not seem to require any particular answer, which was restful in a way Isadora had not anticipated. Julian was present in the house without being obtrusive. She saw him at dinner, occasionally in the library, once in the garden when she had gone out early and found him already there, reading, who had looked up and said good morning and returned to his book without making anything of the encounter. She was in the portrait gallery on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week when she stopped before the painting of a young woman she had not seen before. The subject was perhaps 25, dark-haired, with an expression that was not quite smiling but was not quite composed either. Something in between, something that looked like a person in the act of deciding whether to be happy. Vivienne came up behind her. "That is my mother," Vivienne said. "She died when I was 11. My uncle has not moved the portrait since." She said it the way one states a fact that has been a fact for so long it no longer requires any particular weight of delivery. Then she moved on to look at the next painting, and Isadora remained where she was, looking at the young woman in the portrait and carrying the name Celeste without context for a long moment before she followed. The Countess's second action arrived by post the following week. She had written to Lady Marguerite Ravensmere in Bath, Julian's great-aunt, who was 81 and had the social authority that comes from outliving everyone who might have contradicted her. In terms that described Isadora as a ward in need of recall. Vivienne read the reply aloud at the breakfast table without preamble, in the tone she used for items of mild interest. "Madam," Vivienne read, "I have no authority over my nephew's guests. Yours, etc., Marguerite Ravensmere." She set the letter down and reached for the toast. She wrote it on the back of her own letter, which is efficient. Isadora absorbed this. She absorbed also what Vivienne mentioned a few days later, that her extended stay at Ashmere Hall had, by the middle of June, effectively closed her London marriage prospects for the current season by rumor, which was how these things worked, Vivienne said, with the matter-of-fact candor of someone who found the mechanisms of society interesting rather than threatening. "You will have to decide whether that matters to you," Vivienne said. Isadora's hands tightened once in her lap. She stilled them. "I am still deciding," she said. Week 10, an evening after dinner. Warm enough that the terrace doors had been left open, and Isadora had gone out to find Julian, because she had been deciding for 2 weeks, and she had reached the limit of what she could decide alone. He was standing at the far end of the terrace with a cigar, which she had not seen him smoke before. He heard her step and turned his head. "Your Grace," she said. "Lady Isadora," he said. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I am finished with elegant ways. Are you courting me?" He put out the cigar. He turned fully and looked at her with that contained expression that she had learned in 10 weeks to read as something other than coldness. "I am observing you," he said. "I have been observing you since the 14th of April. I have not courted you because I did not want to interrupt what I was watching. If I had asked you to dance 6 weeks ago, your mother would have permitted it for my title, and I would have seen you only in motion. I wanted to see you still. I am prepared to court you if you will permit it. I am equally prepared to continue as we are." "Why me, Julian?" she said. He was quiet for 3 seconds. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was deciding how to say plainly. "My sister Celeste died 8 years ago," he said. "She died of a marriage my mother arranged, and your mother's doctrine perfected. She was 29. I was 23 when it began. My mother forbade me from intervening, and I did not know how to stop it without her permission. And Celeste wrote me a letter near the end. She said she was not unhappy. She said she was simply finished." He stopped. "I have spent 10 years teaching myself to recognize, in ballrooms and supper rooms, the posture of a young woman being erased by her own family. I keep a record of what I observe. You are the 7th entry." Isadora said nothing. "At Almack's on the 14th of April, Julian continued, I watched you swallow a tear, keep your spine, and deliver a cup of negus without spilling a drop, while your mother told you that your cousin's grave should be your instruction. I thought, that is not weakness she has been taught to hide. She has been taught to hide courage. I have been watching you for 10 weeks to see whether I was right." He paused. "I was." The evening was quiet around them. Somewhere in the garden below the terrace, a bird was settling for the night. "My mother has called me obedient for 9 years," Isadora said. "No one has called me courageous. I knew the words were different words. I did not know they were different things." She looked at him. "I know now." "They are very different things," Julian said. "May I have a week to decide whether I wish to be courted?" she asked. "You may have a year," he said. "I have waited 10 years to be in time. A week or a year, whichever you need." She nodded. She did not offer her hand. She turned and walked back to the house, and he heard the terrace door, and he remained where he was, with the extinguished cigar and the quiet garden below him. And he understood, standing alone in the warm June evening, that he had just spoken plainly to a woman for the first time in a decade. He had not performed anything. He had not deployed the mask or the careful distance or the cultivated indifference that had become, over 10 years, so habitual he had forgotten it was a tool. He had simply told her the truth. He had heard his own voice doing it and not recognized it at first, and then recognized it as the voice he had had before Celeste died. The voice of a 23-year-old who did not yet know how to be unreachable. He did not know what to do with the knowledge. He stood on the terrace until the garden was fully dark. Week 10, the evening of the same day. Late. Isadora came into the library alone to find a book, and found instead, on Julian's writing desk, a small leather journal under a blotter she opened by accident. The brass latch was not secured, and the cover lifted when she set her candle down, and she saw her own initials on the 7th page before she understood what she was looking at. She read the first entry. Miss E.C., Lady Marchmont's, March 1818. Then the second. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Dates, initials, brief notations of what he had observed, the outcome of each. Intervened through sisters' correspondence. Married Captain Whitby, 1820. Letter received, 1823. I am well. And then, below, in a different hand from the same pen. Outcome, not reached. Outcome, not reached. Outcome, not reached. She turned to the 7th entry. The date was the 14th of April. She read what he had written. The supper room, the tear, the negus cup, the grip on her arm, her mother's instruction about Lavinia's grave, the observation about the hand tremoring, and then stilling. And she read the final line, which said, he was marking her, and would return the following Wednesday to confirm. Julian walked in. She did not hear him until he was already inside the room. He stopped when he saw her at the desk with the journal open, and he did not speak. He crossed to the chair opposite the desk and sat down, and he waited. Isadora read the 7th entry again. Then she closed the journal and set it on the desk between them. The library held them in silence for a moment. How many of the 6 did you reach in time? She asked. 2, he said. What happened to the other 4? He answered her plainly, without softening it. The wrong letter, the wrong relation, the timing that missed by a week. The woman in Derbyshire whose name he still did not know the current form of. He told her about Miss H.G. of Greyvale and the grandmother who had understood immediately, and the position in Edinburgh, which was not a triumph. He told her all of it. Isadora's hands were not still in her lap. She did not weep. She pressed her palms flat against her skirt and held them there and looked at the journal on the desk between them. You have been watching me since April, she said. His voice was steady. Yes. And you wrote it down. I write everything down, he said. It is the only way I know to hold it. And the 2 you reached, she said. The letter from Miss E.C., you kept it? Inside the front cover, he said, until the paper wore out. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved. Not a crack, nothing as dramatic as that, but a shift. The way light shifts on water when the angle changes. I believed for 9 years that my mother's instructions saved me from Lavinia, she said. I believed I was surviving. I thought surviving was a different thing from what happened to the 4. It is a different speed, Julian said. That is all it is. She absorbed this. She sat with it the way she sat with things she was not ready to speak aloud yet. Then the Countess's 3rd action arrived. and the fourth delivered together by the Tuesday Morning Post in 2 letters. One addressed to Julian, which Vivian brought to the breakfast table. One addressed to Isadora in Frederick's own hand, which had arrived separately. Vivian set Julian's letter before him and said nothing. He read it, set it down, and looked at Isadora. "Your mother has written to the Earl," he said. "She has instructed him to direct Frederick to denounce you publicly at his Oxford club. She has threatened his allowance." Isadora's face did not change, but she picked up Frederick's letter, which she had not yet opened, and broke the seal. She read it through once. Then she read it again. Then she set it on the table beside her cup and looked at it. And something happened in her chest that was not quite relief and was not quite grief, but contained both. "Frederick wrote to me last Tuesday," she said. "He told me what Papa asked of him." She paused. "He told me his answer was no. He says he's coming to Ashmere Hall on Friday, not to London, not to his club. Papa may withdraw him from Oxford. Frederick says he will read law in Kent if his allowance is withdrawn." She looked up at Julian. He wrote it in his own hand, without supervision. He says it is the first time in his life he has written a letter that no one read before it was sealed. Julian looked at her steadily. "Friday," he said. She met his eyes. "Friday," she said. "The night before Lady Harwood's ball." Julian was at his writing desk, drafting a note to Lady Harwood when Isadora came in. She did not speak. She sat in the chair opposite, the same chair she had sat in the night she found the journal, and she placed her right hand on the desk between them, palm up, ungloved. Julian set down his pen. He covered her hand with his left, palm over palm, not laced, simply the weight of one hand over another, and held it for a full minute before he spoke. "Tomorrow," he said, "if she takes your arm, step back once. One step, clearly, so the room sees it. If she does not take your arm, speak first. Do not wait for her to set the terms of the conversation. If Frederick's letter has not been confirmed by noon, send Vivian to the coaching inn herself. She knows the road." Isadora nodded. "You will not be alone in the room," he said. "But I will not intervene until you have finished. That is what you asked." "That is what I asked," she said. He lifted his hand. She withdrew hers and stood, and left without looking back. Julian remained at the desk. He did not pick up the pen immediately. He sat with the lamplight and the draft letter and the knowledge that tomorrow the mask would not come back. It had not been back since the garden, and he had not tried to put it on. And he did not know yet what this meant for the days after tomorrow, for the weeks and the years that followed tomorrow, for the man he would be when the decade of watching was finished, and he was required to simply live. He found that he did not know that man's shape yet. He found that this did not frighten him as much as it should have. In her room, Isadora took out Frederick's letter and read it one more time, then folded it carefully and put it in the front of her dress for the morning. Lady Harwood's ball, Grosvenor Square, mid-June, the last ball of the season. Isadora arrived with Vivian as her chaperone, and the room received this with the particular quality of interest that London rooms apply to anything that departs from the expected arrangement. She was not with her mother, with her. She was with Julian Ravensmere's 19-year-old niece, in a pale blue gown she had chosen herself. And she moved through the room with Vivian beside her, and the letter against her sternum, and the particular quality of stillness that comes not from performance, but from having already decided. She had asked Julian to be present. She had not told him what she would say. He was there, at the far edge of the room, near the east windows, in conversation with Lord Harwood. He did not look at her when she entered. She did not look at him. They were two people in the same room, and that was enough. Supper interval. The east window. Isadora was standing with a cup she had not drunk from when she heard her mother's footsteps, and she turned before the Countess reached her, which meant she was already facing her when the Countess arrived, which was not what her mother had intended. Isadora. The Countess's voice was low, but the east window was not far from where Lady Harwood stood with 5 other guests, and the acoustics of old rooms are not kind to people who wish to be quiet and carrying at once. You will come home with me tonight. You have embarrassed your father for 12 weeks. The carriage is waiting. Isadora did not lower her eyes. Mama, she said, at the volume her mother had chosen, I am not coming home tonight. I am not coming home. Isadora. I am 22 years old, Isadora said. For 9 years you have told me that a woman who weeps dies unmarried. You told me that the night Lavinia cried at Marchmont's, when I was 13 and she was 19. Lavinia did die unmarried, Mama, at 27. Of a fever she had no will to fight. I believed for 9 years that you saved me from her fate. I learned this spring that I have been living the same fate, only at a different speed. The Countess's fan moved once in her hand and was still. Lord Ashmere's niece invited me to Ashmere Hall 3 months ago, Isadora continued. I accepted. I have been there most of that time, and I will be there tomorrow. You may write to me. I will not write first. But you may write. The Countess's gaze moved, briefly, to the edge of the circle where Julian had appeared. Isadora saw her see him, and then returned to her daughter, and she played the card she had been holding since Tuesday. Frederick comes down from Oxford on Friday, the Countess said. Your father has instructed him to break with you publicly at his club. He will do it. He is 17, and your father has threatened his allowance, and Frederick is not strong enough to refuse. Isadora looked at her mother. She reached into the front of her dress and took out the folded letter and held it, not opening it, simply held it where her mother could see the handwriting on the outside. Frederick wrote to me last Tuesday, Mama, she said. He told me what Papa asked of him. He told me his answer in his own hand, without your supervision, for the first time in his life. His answer was no. He is coming to Ashmere Hall on Friday, not to London, not to his club. Papa may withdraw him from Oxford. Frederick says he will read law in Kent if he must. He told me this, and he sealed the letter himself. And he told me it was the first letter he had written that no one read before it left his hands. She paused. You have lost him too, Mama. The Countess's fan closed. Lady Harwood, 61 years old, silver-haired, who had known the Ravensmere family for 40 years, and who had been standing 4 feet from the east window since before supper, stepped forward. She addressed the Countess, not Isadora, in the quiet voice of a woman who does not need volume to be heard. Helena, Lady Harwood said. I was in the supper room at Almack's on the 14th of April. I was 6 feet from you when you spoke to your daughter about her cousin's grave. I heard every word. I have been waiting since April to say that I heard it. I have said so now. The room was very quiet. Julian stepped forward. He did not take Isadora's arm. He stood at her left shoulder, and he looked at the Countess, and he spoke once. Lady Brentbury, he said, your daughter has not been coached. I saw courage in the Almack's supper room on the 14th of April. You saw a tool. That is the only difference between us. He turned to Isadora. Lady Vivian's carriage is at the door. Shall we go? Isadora looked at her mother for a moment. at the closed fan and the expression that was doing no calculations now because there was nothing left to calculate. And she spoke her last sentence to the Countess with the same steadiness she had held all evening. "Good night, Mama," she said. "I will not close the door. I will not hold it open either. That is your choice, not mine." She walked out. Vivienne followed. Julian walked behind them both. In the vestibule, Isadora stopped. She turned. "Julian," she said. He met her eyes. "Isadora," he said. "Thank you for standing where you stood," she said. "I needed you there. I did not need you to speak. You spoke anyway." "I could not help myself," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That is why I let you." Frederick arrived Friday morning with one trunk, a letter from the Earl revoking his allowance, and an expression that was trying to be apologetic, and was in fact simply relieved. Vivienne settled him in the East Wing with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything. And by luncheon, he was in the garden with a Kent law directory Vivienne had found somewhere, and a look of cautious interest in his own future that Isadora had never seen on his face before. The following Tuesday, a carriage arrived from London. Clémence stepped out of it, 14 years old, with one bag and a letter from the Countess in her hand. Vivienne received her at the door. Clémence gave Vivienne the letter, which was addressed to Isadora, and which contained a single line in the Countess's hand. "Your sister has taken you. You may write, not extracted, not rescued. Simply sent, because the Countess was standing in a house with an Earl who had retired to Dorset and no children left in it, and she had made the only calculation still available to her." Isadora read the letter once. She wrote back a single sheet, which she sealed herself and gave to the footman for the morning post. "Mama, you may write to Clémence directly. She will decide whether to answer. I.B." No further letters came from Grosvenor Square that summer. September, the small chapel at Ashmere Hall, which had not been used for a wedding in 11 years, was dressed with flowers from the garden and held 17 guests. Frederick stood beside the vicar as witness, his allowance not yet restored, and his Kent law reading going well enough that he had stopped counting the weeks until it might be. Clémence and Vivienne sat together in the front pew. Clémence with her watercolors forgotten for once in her lap. Vivienne with her hands folded and her face arranged in an expression of composed pleasure that was, Isadora suspected, covering something considerably warmer. Isadora wore pale rose. She would never wear stiff white silk again. She had decided this in August, quietly, the same way she had been deciding things since June, not as a declaration, simply as a fact she had arrived at and found to be true. Julian was waiting at the front of the chapel with the particular quality of stillness she had come to know as attention, not distance. When she came down the aisle, Frederick's arm under her hand, the September light coming through the old windows at a low angle, Julian looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the Almack's supper room, directly without performance, seeing what was actually there. That evening, the library at Ashmere Hall, the fire laid against the September cool, the rain returned to the windows. Julian was reading. Clémence was on the rug with her watercolors and a glass of water she kept dipping her brush into and then examining with the focused attention of someone who has been given a technical problem to solve. She had asked Julian, some time ago, about the technique in the portrait on the wall. The woman in the painting, the dark-haired one with the expression between smiling and composed. And Julian had answered her. He had named the technique, and the painter, and the year, and then, because Clémence had asked directly, as she asked everything, he had said that the subject was his sister, and that her name was Celeste, and that she had died before Clémence was born. He had said it in the same room where Celeste's portrait hung. looking at the portrait as he spoke, and it was the first time in 8 years he had done that. And the room had received it without difficulty. Clemence had said, "She looks like she is deciding something," and gone back to her watercolors. Isadora came in from the corridor and sat in the chair opposite Julian, and reached across the small table between them. Julian took her hand without looking up from his book, his hand going there the way it goes to something it already knows the location of, without needing to look, simply and without ceremony. Frederick was laughing somewhere down the east corridor, and Vivienne's voice rose in response, and then Frederick laughed again at whatever she had said. The rain was steady on the windows. Clemence dipped her brush. Julian turned a page. Isadora thought, "Once, my mother told me I would die of this. I am sitting in a library." And then, let the thought go. The way you let go of something you have been carrying for so long that the act of setting it down is its own kind of arrival. She tightened her fingers around Julian's. He returned the pressure without looking up, without speaking. His hand simply answering hers, the way it had learned to do, the way she thought it would go on doing for a very long time. The rain continued. The candles burned. Somewhere in the east wing, Frederick was still laughing,